Job chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Know that these words are true and can be trusted. Amen? Amen. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then. He is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "Are you talking like a foolish woman? Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Amen. Now this morning as I prepared this message, I know that our congregation has gone through many loss and suffering. In the past few weeks, we have lost many family members. Just this past week, my grandmother lost her brother as well. And as we remember Easter, which wasn't too long ago, it can be hard to shake the pain of losing loved ones in our families with the joy of the resurrection. In this message, I'm going to ask you to take a look at 3 things choosing faith won't do for someone who suffers. And then I want to look at 3 things that choosing faith will do for those who are suffering. First, I want you to understand that when we choose faith in the midst of our suffering, it is not going to take away the pain of the situation. The pain will still be there. It will not stop our minds from asking all those difficult questions or others from asking questions. But finally, when we choose faith in our suffering, we need to realize that it is not going to bring us to any logical conclusion or reason for our suffering. In other words, it won't answer the "why me" question. Now, as depressing as that may sound, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I want us to look at what choosing faith in the midst of suffering will actually do for us. The first and most important thing it does is that it reminds us that God is the one in control. The second thing is that choosing faith in our suffering is that it is a rare gift from God for us. Which leads us to the third thing. And I see that it is going to bring you closer to God when you choose faith in the midst of your suffering. We know that Satan is our enemy, and he tries to devour and destroy us, and he tries to have us fall into sin, and he tries to destroy our witness. But what I want to tell you is that it is not what is happening in the book of Job. You see, Job was a faithful servant of God in all aspects, but Satan believed he would only be obedient because God was blessing him. He was just one step away from cursing God and falling. So he asked God to allow him to take away those blessings, and surely Job would curse God. Now in our passage we find Satan attempting to tear Job down through his wife. But by the time we reach our passage, Job had lost absolutely everything. He was considered by the world to be totally worthless. In the eyes of the world, he was done. He was finished. It was over. There was no hope. His wife simply was the voice of the rest of society around Job. Job had not only lost his worldly possessions, but he had lost his health as well. And as he was covered from head to toe with sores, it was probably one of the most disgusting things you have ever seen. Now you may be sitting here in ashes. None of us are sitting here in ashes, but you may have some ailment to you. So how many have you been where Job was? Perhaps you have a disease or sickness that caused you to believe that your life was over. Maybe you got that bad news. Have you ever been to a point in your life where you wanted to strike out at God because of what sickness or disease has done to you or a loved one? I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we may have some anger towards God. I believe that we have all been there from one time or another. But one thing that we have to remember is that God did not bring the sickness or disease into this world. But it entered the world when humanity decided to sin against God and turned its back on God in the Garden of Eden. Another aspect of this is seeing how God has dealt with his children throughout history when it comes to suffering. God has always been there for his children, and he will never leave them nor forsake them. Some may have thought that God had abandoned them because of the severity of the storms in their life. But in reality, God was right there in their midst. Also, as difficult as it is to understand, we also know that God uses trials and suffering and temptations to mature and grow his children. But even in the middle of all his suffering, we find that Job doesn't shake his fist at God, but is humble. It is not Job, but his wife that is discouraged and troubled. I have found that when loved ones are suffering, there may be a time when we get angry with God for allowing this suffering. And we begin to put demands on God. We also know that this is part of a normal grief cycle. But in this situation, Job's wife doesn't strike out at God directly, but she goes to Job and ridicules him for his faith by telling him to curse God and just die. I believe that Job's wife was so frustrated and upset over seeing her husband in such agony and suffering, and in her mind, Job was done. He was going to die anyway, so he might as well just get it over with and curse God. And God would definitely probably take his life. That's what she thought. I believe in this situation we find that it is not really Job's wife who is the problem, but it is the enemy who brings Job's wife to her knees by planting doubt and despair into her mind. And so Job's wife becomes a source of discouragement and trouble for Job. This is nothing really that new for Satan. He planted seeds of doubt in the minds of Adam and Eve, which ultimately led to their fall from innocence. And even today, we know that Satan is still the enemy of God, and he is still trying to draw believers away from God. And he can do this through many different ways, especially through circumstances in our life, and by suggesting hard and bad thoughts about God and God's intentions. But we have to remember that Satan is a liar, and that there is nothing that Satan does that is based in truth. He is the father of all lies, and his recount of God in our temptation is nothing but false, and we cannot fail to that falsehood. And we can see that in our passage that Job was faced by Satan's attempt to make him fall away from God and curse God. But we also find that Job did not fail prey to this temptation, and that Job did actually resist Satan. And ultimately, after many trials, Job did finally overcome this difficult trial and temptation. Job was a man who was righteous in the eyes of God, and who strove to serve God in all that he did. Now, I believe that there is not a person here today who has faced the sudden and tragic nature of Job's trials to its full extent. We have all had to endure difficult times and hard trials in our lives, but nothing like Job's. There are many people in this world who face very difficult times and suffer greatly at the hand of some disease or other circumstance outside of their control, such as being laid off of a job, being without work or prospects of work, or other possible financial stresses or problems. And these same people may wonder why God would allow such devastation and hurt in this world. But when we read Scripture, it is clear as to why. The Bible tells us that we are all sinners, and because of that sin, we have all fallen out of the perfection and innocence God created for us. And when sin entered the world, it brought with it sickness, disease, and pain, and suffering, and even death. So when trouble comes our way, laying the blame on God is really not an option. It is not something that we can really honestly do, since He did not bring about these things. It is sin that brings death, destruction, and devastation, and it touches all of us. If we believe that God is cruel to allow this to happen, then we believe that we are immune to God's law and the punishment that comes along with that disobedience. Let me share a story with you. There was a woman who was riding out a hurricane in her attic with her family, and the winds had blown her house off its foundation, and the rising water was threatening to flood the house to the roof and drown all 5 people in the attic. Outside the house, there was 2 huge trees that had fallen around the house, one in the front and one in the back, and they had wedged the house sort of in place and somehow kept it from collapsing. That's when the 4-year-old daughter decided that it was time to pray. Sometime later, the woman recalled, I've been so scared in my life, but that's when my daughter said, Mom, we've got to get down and pray. We need to calm down. And when they finished praying, the water actually started to recede. And eventually, the family was able to work their way down the attic stairs and into the house. They found that every exit was blocked by the trees that had wedged them in place. But that was actually what saved their lives that night. The woman's husband took the family by the hand and led them through a window. And all 5 members walked a few blocks they had walked to reach a local middle school that was to be a rescue shelter. This is where they would stay for the next 10 days. Now, at the middle school, there were more than 350 people, many of them injured, lived without running water or electricity for the next week and a half. The families would bathe outside from a water spigot, which they later found out was contaminated. Inside the school, toilets refused to flush, and conditions became dangerously unhealthy. And after 5 days, most of the families decided to move outside where they lived on the parking lot for another 5 days. With their world in disarray, and the world seemingly falling down around them, the families began to pray for a miracle. In the face of such a disaster, it was the only thing that they knew to do. You see, people have been dealing with destructive powers of hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes as long as humans and forces of nature have been around. But the fact of the matter is that even when the storm is finally over, the battle is not. Another rages on. The battle I speak of is really the battle of the heart. You see, most people will feel it necessary to ask the important question of why. Why would the God of creation allow us to go through so much suffering? Why would God allow this to happen to me? Today I'm here to tell you that God is not afraid of your tough questions. God does not turn a deaf ear to those who are suffering and enduring suffering. In our passage, we find one of the oldest stories in recorded history, and it is an anchor within the Bible. This story reveals a man named Job who undergoes so much suffering, and even still today, the name Job carries with the distinction of suffering and affliction. But this story is not a great story because of the suffering. This story is great because of the way Job dealt with his suffering. We will never forget Job, as he has been through so much. And here we find that we read the story of Job, that he responded with great suffering, with even a greater faith. His story and his response leave us a very important question that we have to ask ourselves. And that is this: how are you going to respond when it seems as if your world is falling apart? Are you going to strike out in anger? Or will you dare to choose faith over anger? Now, choosing faith over anger in the midst of suffering is not an easy thing to do, and I realize this. Believe me, I am still a work in progress. God is not finished with us yet. Our story reveals that as well, and we find that even if we are willing to make the choice of faith over anger in our time of suffering, that it does not mean the battle is over. But what we realize is that when we choose faith over anger in the midst of our suffering, we find that the battle is far from over. Just because we have faith in God, this does not mean that all our trials and tribulations and suffering will end. It means that we are actually not alone on this journey. Scripture teaches us that suffering and those trials and tribulations that we face in life are like a waterlogged family from the hurricane. There are going to be times when the biggest battles in our lives come after the storm has passed. Choosing faith in suffering will not eliminate the pain. Job was clearly crushed by the pain of suffering. He tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground when he heard that his children had died. Job 1:20. His physical ailments were so painful, he used broken pottery as an instrument in his homemade surgery. And yet, in the midst of such pain and heartache, Job issued some of the greatest statements of faith that we have ever heard. Job 1:21. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job 2:10. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. How is it that a man can choose such great faith and still feel such great pain? Well, how else could it be? If we take the risk of loving those around us, the grief will be tremendous. If those we love may be taken from us. The other choice is to never love at all. And Job simply would not take that alternative. Here's another example. Many of you know that I work with children, and for many years, there's times when we have to make Mother's Day gifts. And that's next week. But once there was this 5-year-old I was working with, and we created this vase and put a plant in it, and we were going to give it to his mother for Mother's Day. We even put a box so that the plant would go in it safely and securely and make it home. But as we dismissed the children with their gifts and he was running down the hallway, he tripped. And as you can all imagine, where that plant went flying through the air. And there was not much hope for saving that plant when it hit the tile floor and smashed. And of course, when it hit the floor and smashed, all the conversation stopped. as everybody looked in astonishment to see what the reaction was going to be. And so this 5-year-old little boy who created this most expensive gift that he thought, his joy turned quickly to sorrow, and he crouched down on the floor with his broken gift for his mom and started to cry. Of course, the mom was a little bit uncomfortable at the moment, and people were watching her. Her son was crying on the floor, and she went over and patted him and gave him a hug and said, "It's okay. It doesn't matter." Those words, "it doesn't matter." I went over to her and I kindly corrected her and said, "It does matter. It does matter." Mom cradled her little boy in her arms and rocked him back and forth and cried with him for a few minutes. And when the crying ceased, she said, "Let's go home and see what we can make of what's left." And so if you don't know, some moms have magical powers, and she got out her glue gun and a shoebox, and she created this multicolored mosaic thing that was really quite amazing. And the artwork, after the tragedy, was actually much more beautiful than a plant. And of course, it lasted a lot longer. You see it as a constant reminder that grief is real and that loss hurts. It is also a reminder that from great loss, great beauty can eventually emerge. Choosing faith in suffering will not stop the questions. In the book of Job, 2 chapters of great faith are followed immediately by 35 chapters of great questions. Job wasn't alone in his questions. Jeremiah couldn't preach without weeping and constantly questioned how God could have allowed such despair. David wrestled with questions for years, especially while hiding from Saul and wondering if he'd ever live to reign and be the prophet had told him to be. Remember how he began his Psalm 13? "How long, O Lord, will you forget me? How long will you hide your face from me?" The questions about suffering even reached the mouth of Jesus, as he generally wrestled with the internal agony of the crucifixion. "Must I really do this?" he asked, under such stress that the blood vessels popped in his forehead. "Is there no other way, Father?" Even when we make up in our minds to choose faith over anger, the questions are still going to be there. Questions from our mind, as well as questions from our friends and others around us. Choosing faith over anger in the midst of suffering will not remove the pain, and it will not stop the questions. But I can see one thing else that it will not do. Choosing faith in suffering will not create a logical reason for your suffering. The book of Job presents one of the most unusual pictures in the Bible. The God of the universe entertains an audience with Satan. The subject of their conversation is nearly this flawless man and how he might be tortured. God himself takes a seat to see how much of a beating the overpowered man can take. Now, if you're like me, you really do not like this story. There is nothing about this story that you like. First, I don't like the fact that God even entertained an audience with Satan. Second, I really don't like when I think of God watching from the sidelines. Nothing about this story seems to make sense to me, and it certainly isn't very satisfying. But when I began to study and pray about the subject of suffering, I realized that this is actually the point. You see, any suffering really doesn't make any sense. The more natural expectation in life is spelled out in the first paragraph of Job. As humans, we want for every baby a good family, a good childhood, a good education, eventually a fulfilling and well-accomplished, successful job that fulfills their every need, a good home, and a retirement set against the sunset of a perfect life. Right? It is our desire to want the first paragraph of Job. That paragraph tells us this man was blameless, upright, righteous, and the greatest man among his people. He was a man who did without something we'd all like to do without. He was a man without suffering. Our expectation of such a life soon collides with what we call reality and everyday life. Suffering comes well armed with grief, hardship, misfortune, illness, crisis, and tragedy, and even more. It pays no attention to age, sex, nationality, or the size of one's bank account. In the midst of such suffering and hardship, faith is a valid and necessary option for the believer, even when it appears that choosing faith over anger is just plain old illogical. Choosing faith in the midst of suffering, like Job did, to many may look like insanity. Job's friends tried with all the reason to find logic in this situation, while on the other hand, they looked at the illogical comparison of great faith and great suffering. Likewise, in Christ, God worked his greatest gift through what appeared to be his greatest loss, when Christ hung on the cross at Calvary. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Despite all the reasons why Job might have chosen faith in the midst of his suffering, he chose faith anyway. By doing so, he made the better choice by far and survived his season of grief. Now, as we look back on Job's choices, we can also see how these choices serve to illustrate the wonderful things that choosing faith over anger in the midst of our suffering will do for you. The first thing I see that choosing faith over anger in the midst of your suffering will do for you is it will remind you that God is in control. To Job, it would not have made sense to him, but there's no doubt that the conversation was crystal clear to God. God was not tricked by Satan. He didn't misunderstand. God clearly weighed the options, considered the ramifications, and made a choice. And at no time in this matter was God out of control. With that in mind, what are the options in the midst of out-of-control suffering in our lives? On the one hand, we could reject God, who allows suffering, and we know that many in this world do exactly that. And on the other hand, we could trust the only being in all of creation that remains in control above all evil and all suffering. And because the realm of suffering doesn't make much sense to us, it stands to reason that someone having great faith in the midst of suffering seems to make even lesser sense. However, when one looks at the evidence, we can come to the conclusion that placing your life in the hands of the only God who can take care of you in this world and in the next is ultimately the only logical action a person could ever take. Choosing faith in suffering is a rare gift of God. Job was wise enough to know that God had controlled the good days and the success of his life, just as surely as God was now controlling the bad days. Beyond that, Job learned a lesson that must be remembered in a time of suffering. Nothing about your present circumstances, may they be good or bad, have changed the first thing about the nature of God. God is still the same today as he was yesterday, and he will be the same tomorrow. That God is always worthy of our praise. In the midst of the worst of it, he knew so little that seemed secure. Job hung on to the one truth, that I know my Redeemer lives. He told us, his more comfortable friends, that in the end, he will stand upon the earth. Without the circumstances, we might not have remembered Job's words at all. Understanding how bad Job had it when he had such a thing is what makes the words more memorable to us. and it is a precious gift to God. Our ultimate gift to God is amidst the suffering is our faith and trust in Him. It is our worship of His goodness and His care for us. Choosing faith in suffering will bring you closer to God. Though he didn't know it yet, Job was on his way to the most intimate encounter with God that he ever had in his lifetime. Through the season of suffering that had fallen upon him, he was starting a short journey that would lead to his greatest understanding of who God was. The road of suffering was the only road that led him to a more intimate encounter with God. Unfortunately, not every person comes closer to God on the road of suffering. Some use the road to go in the opposite direction, going further away from God than ever before. Pharaoh, for instance, destroyed his entire country when he refused to acknowledge God in the midst of the pre-Exodus suffering. Most of the kings would rule the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah, couldn't find faith in the midst of various hardships, and both kingdoms fell as a direct result of their faithlessness. But for every lost opportunity, the Bible provides plenty of success stories. After the days of popularity disappeared, the disciples knew all about suffering. Thankfully, they also found a life-changing resurrection at the worst end of their weekend lives they've ever remembered. To say that they learned more about God through that weekend would probably be an understatement of history. They found that the Jesus they followed was the confirmed Christ, the Son of God, the truly and only Messiah, who faced great suffering with great courage. And he has still, today, is changing lives. You know, we may never know why we have to endure the suffering that we have to endure. But we can rest assured that God is in control. And even if we don't ever find out here, we can know that God is working all things for our good. For those here today that may not know God on a personal level, for those who do not have a saving personal relationship with Jesus Christ, I know that you are suffering, that you have experienced suffering, that you have experienced loss. But I also know the God who wants to be there for you. I pray that today you may decide to follow Him, that you may surrender your heart to Him, that today may be the day where you will not suffer alone. We all have been enemies of the cross at one time in our lives. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God. Many of us have had doubts. Many of us have suffered. And we may not have all the answers, but we do serve, honor, and glorify the one who does have all the answers. And today I want to tell you, He is not afraid of your tough questions. And I hope, as I close, that this may have been a time of healing for you, a time where you have drawn closer to Him, and that you may choose faith over your suffering by the power of the one we serve, Jesus Christ. Amen? Amen. Let us pray. Father God, we come before you and we thank you. We praise your holy name and your eternity. We ask, Lord God, that you would come and comfort us in our loss, in our sorrow, in our despair, in our grief. And Lord God, may your face shine upon us. May you be gracious unto us. May you lift your countenance upon us and give us your peace, which is a perfect peace, both now